Welcome to the Australian Naval History video and podcast series. It is a production of the very active Naval Studies Group at the University of New South Wales, Canberra, in partnership with the Australian Naval Institute, the Naval Historical Society, the Submarine Institute of Australia and the Sea Power Centre Australia. I'm Greg Swinden, a former naval officer and a naval historian from the Sea Power Centre Australia. This is the second of 3 episodes on the RAN in Papua New Guinea. This episode will focus on the establishment of the Maritime Element of the Papua New Guinea Defence Force, the PNGDF. Joining me today are Commodore Sam Bateman, who was CEO of HMAS Aitapi, the first PNG-based attack class patrol boat, and later the RAN member of the Joint Planning Staff in Port Moresby, and the first director of the Maritime Operations in the PNGDF. A very busy time. Also Mr Jim Nockels, Australian Defence Representative in Port Moresby in the period leading up to the self-government in independence. And welcome back to Commander Viv Littlewood, who was the XO at HMAS Teheran Gao during 1973-74. Gentlemen, welcome and thank you for coming to see us again. Jim, I'll lead off with you. Can you describe the political and the strategic background in forming the PNGDF and HQ PNGDF in the early 1970s?
Yes, I allude back to the previous episode where Tristan has given an overview of the historic geostrategic significance of PNG to Australia. And for well over 150 years we saw PNG as this dark, foreboding, some said bird, hanging over Australia with a beak that almost touched our shores. And that really was fed on by our own concerns about Asia and the fear of Asia. The Second World War brought that directly home to us. And following that, with the end of the war, of course, Australia stood back. But then, of course, the emergence of the winds of change in Southeast Asia, end of colonial rule, confrontation, the whole area of the Malaysian insurgency, and then the Indonesian acquisition of West Papua as a result of UN decisions. Australia recognised that there was a threat there of great significance, and the 2 ways to respond to that were firstly to build a capability in PNG, a military army on the ground capability, able to deter and possibly in the first stages slow down any foreign incursion, because we now had an actual land border with a potential enemy at that stage, Sukarno's Indonesia. The second leg of this was to maintain the significance of maritime patrol capability in the region with the retention of a naval base in Manus, and particularly a refuelling capability. That was the environment which we saw deciding, in fact, the way in which the Papua New Guinea defence capabilities were developed from the mid-60s on until the early 70s. However, with the changes in government in Indonesia, Suharto government, an accord signed with them, stabilisation of what was seen then as an expansion of communism, the Vietnam War to a degree, saw Australian perspective changing as to the necessity of a strong land force capability in PNG. This also coincided with a decision in Canberra to begin to review what the future of PNG might hold, not just from the point of view of independence, where the Department of Territories had begun planning for some form of self-government by 1975. The second element of this was what is actually happening in New Guinea, and this is where, in a sense, my being initially posted to PNG focused, because it was recognised that Australia did not have a strong understanding of the domestic environment in PNG. 2 sources of, for want of a better word, intelligence coming into the country, to Australia that is, were from the PNG administration, basically the KIAP system through the Department of the Administrator reporting on domestic involvement, Mount Turu cults, things like this, to which we had posted from Australia a ACES representative, an ASIO representative, and a JIB, then becoming JIO representative, providing some different sorts of feeds. The second main source of intelligence as such came from the army presence. So we had these very diffuse sources of information, and it was decided that Australia needed to review the domestic situation in PNG. So late 60s to early 70, a review was undertaken, and it was recognised Australia didn't really understand what was happening in PNG and had no capacity to judge what a future PNG might look like from a domestic security point of view. So it was recognised that there was a need for more information on that, and I was initially posted to the Department of the Administrator to try and bring a focus of that sort of development back to Canberra as a line of reporting to enhance what was then emerging as a strategic and international policy capability in a reforming Defence Department. Remember, at the same time, we still had separate departments of Army, Navy and Air Force, and they were going their own way, and one of the reasons for the defence reform was to try and bring all of this together. So by the early 70s, we see an aggregation of these various factors coming together in PNG. Fundamental to that intelligence review I mentioned was a recognition from a strategic policy point of view and from a defence white paper point of view that PNG no longer PNG no longer existed as a shield or a forward operating base for Australian military personnel. The biggest concern became for Australia the stability of a newly emerging country on our borders and what we could do. Now that challenge then raised questions for the way we were doing things. It saw a slowdown of the commitment to expand the PNG military land capability in particular as a result of those earlier strategic environmental views about threats from the region. And it led to a question of what do we do domestically, and can the PIR, as it then was, have a role in this? The challenge to that was the PIR training regime and the whole recruitment process, and its general focus was on a land-based operational infantry capability. The Army, or the PNG Command, had refused to involve the PNGDF in any joint training with the police in domestic security situations, aid to the civil power. And basically the Army view was there are too many legal and technical issues, we don't train, we have nothing to do with them. So we have in Moresby in the early 70s an administration switching quickly to an independence mode, particularly with the emergence of the Labor government and Gough Whitlam's commitments. We have an Army regime which understands that something's happening but has no clear understanding of which way to go except to continue maintaining its operational capability. We have a naval capability which the significance of Manus as a forward maritime operating base has reduced enormously in significance. And the most people can think of is, well, PNG will need some sort of maritime patrol capability, hence the commitment of the attack class patrol boats. So we see by 1972 a whole new situation emerging, trying to shape this against an emerging political environment in Port Moresby, where PNG politicians were not fully aware of the true significance and the implications for a new country, and in particular a defence capability. The administration and the training it had given to politicians was focused on developing a nation. There'd been little or no access or contact with the Army, which were the main policy operators in PNG. Navy was somewhat remote from all of this and remained so for quite a long time until the final commitment for planning when my colleague here, Sam, finally became involved in trying to bring something forward in a joint planning environment. So we've got all this coming together at a time when all of a sudden Labor says, bang, we're putting the foot on the accelerator, wham, it's going to happen. And all of a sudden the challenges became manifest. And one of those challenges was, do you keep a defence force of the size and shape that basically has 2 battalions, ancillary support now, a plugged-in air capability, a plugged-in maritime capability, or do you look at some of the colonial models? Now, during the period I was in Moresby, I spent some time visiting places like the then still British Solomon Islands Protectorate to see what was happening in those Pacific islands about the future. And I came back asking the question, well, was there some merit in reducing the size and cost of a PNGDF component, because the demands on the budget would be quite massive? And was there room for something like a field force or an equivalent enhanced police capability? By the way, in all this historic time, the Defence Force had been continuing to acquire significant and quite sophisticated facilities, lovely new barracks and things like that. It amazed me when I arrived how elegant Murray Barracks was in comparison with many defence facilities in Australia. And we had the police chugging along on a separate pay scale and separate capabilities and separate support. So it was at this time that the Labor government, the new Labor government, began to focus on that, and in particular Bill Morrison, who was the then Minister of Territories, started raising the questions of a field force. And according to Morrison in his memoirs, and I think this is basically true, he gained the approval of key ministers, including Chairman Joint Chiefs of Staff at the time, to create an expanded police capability as a field force and reduce the size of the PNGDF. That, however, did not happen for a variety of reasons, not least the reorganisation of defence and other commitments. This idea faded. Many people say it never had a hope of occurring, but be that as it may, that thought occurred. After that thought bubble, we saw ourselves marching forward to develop a capability that reflected what had really been developed from the mid-60s on, and that was the PNGDF, in a sense, structure that we see today. The problems being excessive costs to the government and massive challenges for what you do with a force that has, in a sense, little or no role in a newly emerging country, because it sees itself as defending the borders and not assisting in what I'll call national development in that sense. So we see a situation as a background to you, really a long background, I'm sorry to say, to your question, as situating where we are in terms of developing a new Papua New Guinea defence organisation. Politically, the politicians were not very much aware of that. By the 72, Australia had formally posted to the PNG government an advisor, a chap called Nick Webb, who'd come from the Strategic and International Policy Division, to assist them in formulating what sort of defence structure there would be. But the influence of Brigadier Jim Norrie, who was then commander of what was then the Joint Force, very close to Samaria, the Prime Minister, was, you need this model, this is where we should go, this is what we need to have. And so we then created joint planning groups, which Sam was involved in, to try and shape what this force would be. But at the end of the day, a large and expensive force, to sell to PNG an independence and an independent capabilities, Australia committed to a status of forces agreement, which would allow us to keep our personnel in PNG but not be subject to local court procedures. A defence cooperation agreement, which basically meant a hidden, a not necessarily public subvention to the continued support of a defence organisation that could not possibly operate under the PNG budget without external Australian support. So we marched then forward with an independent force and a capability, which to this day is a real challenge to the PNG government to support.
Just a slight aside, can you recall how long the previous idea of self-government would have existed before full independence prior to the change in the Australian?
It began emerging in the late 60s, and I think someone alluded earlier in the previous episode to UN missions. So the UN began to raise the question of the future of PNG, and the Australian government began to recognise that with the fall, so to speak, of colonial power around us, the end of the Dutch East Indies Empire, which had been part of our strategic planning equation for so long, that the writing was on the wall, the winds of change were occurring. And so, as I say, by the late 60s, the Department of Territory was actually looking at this concept of of a self-government, at least by 1975. So a lot of work happening. And when I arrived in Moresby, there were large numbers of individuals and groups working on what sort of constitution would happen. Do you have an autochthonous constitution which comes from the people? Do you have an imposed constitution which comes from the top? What would the role of the Defence Force be? All of these things were beginning to emerge, but it was to be a slow process, 72 to 75. All of a sudden, the Whitlam government arrives and said, sorry, off we go. And so within a year, in that 72, 73 period, all of this stuff had to be hammered into concrete in order for the formal negotiations, the handover of defence powers, for which I ultimately became involved when I went back to Canberra in helping negotiate. All of this fell in as part of the overall package that Australia presented to PNG, which, by the way, included an administrative structure, because frankly no one had time to think of anything else, to model what had already been there and what was in Australia. So they have to have a Department of Works, and they have to have a Department of Health, and they have to have a Department of Education, Department of Social Security. We created this replication of Australian administrative processes and systems in a country that was not capable of delivering at that stage, because we had been remiss in training and preparing people. So Noel Levy, the first Secretary of Defence, came into this head of a significant public service department jointly with the chief of the force, without a strong background in either administration or more particularly in knowledge of the defence requirements and needs of defence. Now, in all of this, it wasn't as if everyone in Papua New Guinea said this is a wonderful picture. There were officers in the PNGDF, as it then had become, who felt that this force was too big and too difficult and should be scaled back. There were others in general areas of administration who were worried about the capacity of PNG to indigenise sufficiently quickly many positions of government. So it's the defence picture is part of the more complex picture of Australia's handling, first time ever, a decolonisation.
Yep. Thanks. Sam, you were heavily involved in PNG during this period. What was Australia doing to get the maritime element, previously just the 5 patrol boats and a couple of landing craft, what were they doing to get those ready and transfer across to the PNGDF?
Well, quite frankly, Greg, an awful lot going on. But I suppose a little bit of personal background here would be that towards the end of 1971, I was XO of HMAS Parramatta, and out of the blue one day, I received a phone call from officer posting saying, was I prepared to go back to Papua New Guinea? And having had a previous posting up there in the 1960s, and I said I was. So almost quite a crash posting at literally about 6 weeks' notice. I found myself in Port Moresby just before Christmas 1971 with the family, posted initially as Noik, Port Moresby, had an office down in the oil fuel installation which existed down the waterfront in Port Moresby. There was another REN officer in Port Moresby at the time, Lieutenant McAllister, who effectively was serving as the recruiting officer for the PNG division. Malice aforethought, because I didn't really appreciate at the time that all these exciting, dramatic things were going to start happening in PNG over the next couple of years. And as we've heard, in February 1972, literally a few weeks after I arrived, the Joint Force PNG was created. I was then reposted as a naval member of the Joint Planning Staff, which is a team at Murray Barracks comprising an Army Colonel as the Chief Planning Officer and a Major equivalent, Lieutenant Commander equivalent from each of the 3 services. At that stage, Noik PNG was still in Manus, Commander Bill Bird at the time. I think my posting as Noik Port Moresby lapsed, so I was just in the naval member of the Joint Planning Staff. In June 1972, Captain Lancaster arrived to be the Naval Component Commander. And of course, with the establishment of the Joint Force PNG, the Joint Force had the 3 components, a land component, air component, naval component. Initially, Bill Bird had been the Naval Component Commander, but when Captain Lancaster arrived in June 72, he reverted back to being just CO Teheran Gao. Things moved very quickly through 1972 to the establishment of the PNG Defence Force in February 1973. And at that stage, John Lancaster became Chief of Operations of the PNG Defence Force, and I became the inaugural Director of Maritime Operations in the PNG Defence Force. And that led me through to my 3-year posting in Port Moresby from December 71 through to December 74. So that was the period when all these things were happening in terms of the REN losing its identity as a single service, the absorption of the Army, what had previously been the Army Landing Craft Squadron at Port Moresby into the Maritime Element. Lots of complex issues, some of which Jim has alluded to, lots of controversies, lots of infighting, and there was a few stories to be told there, but that's the background. And of course with the patrol boats, the ceremony, it's self-government when the patrol boats and the naval landing craft had already arrived up there at the time, pulled down their REN white ensigns and hoisted the PNG ensign at the time of self-government.
But I think at that stage, the RAN didn't sort of walk away from looking after the patrol boats or the landing craft. The officers and the sailors, in many respects, just stayed and became members of the PNGDF. Is that correct?
Yes. Well, from the seagoing side, there was a process of fairly rapid localisation of the crews of the patrol boats, and in mid-1974, of course, we achieved our first PNG patrol boat that was fully manned by PNG personnel under the command of then Lieutenant Carrier Frank. But so that process of localisation from 71 to 74, I mean, I suppose in 71 most of the patrol boats were probably half manned by RAN people, but then very quickly it came to a situation where it might only have been the CO, perhaps the XO, and perhaps the chief engineer. And of course, with the formation of the PNG Defence Force, we also, the RN people started wearing these PNG Defence Force coloured patch on their left shirt, etc.
That's the Bird of Paradise,
Bird
I think,
of Paradise,
on the green patch.
Yeah.
And so what happened at Teheran Gao? That was handed over to the PNGDF?
Well, I think Viv Littlewood's probably the best person. He was serving there at the time.
So what happened there, Viv?
There were quite a steady change. One of the early indications were that, as far as the Navy's concerned, everybody on a base or in a ship is responsible to the captain. The Army run things differently. They have logic units, and suddenly there was an Army engineering unit arrived to carry out some civil engineering. They were responsible for the chief engineer back in Port Moresby, which was a bit of a shock to us when we hadn't been used to that sort of thing. And gradually the feeling came that it was change. The impression, and I think Sam's already mentioned it, the impression was that the Army were being a bit naughty because they were the biggest outfit. They thought that the cheapest and best way to run the PNGDF was do it Army way. So they didn't realise that victualling a patrol boat at sea was a bit different from victualling a platoon out in the bush. And I know John Lancaster tried to persuade them to treat signals in a Navy way rather than just as correspondence, which the Army tends to do. But the biggest thing that came out was that the whole PNG Defence Force were going to wear jungle greens. I said in the previous thing that it's a reflection on REN personnel in how they produced a loyalty to the Navy, to the local people. And this was just not on. Fortunately, we got the buzz that there was to be, wasn't in the, they didn't think of it, but it was a mutiny. They weren't going to turn two one day. fortunately, the next day was payday, so they fronted up for pay parade, and I did the thing that we're all trained to do. I read the Articles of War and persuaded them that that sort of thing was not on. But I think, and that message got back to Moresby, of course. Peter Mackay, who was captain of Teheran Gao, was at Moresby at the time, so I was acting CO. But I think that resulted in the Maritime Element staying dressed as sailors, and they just put the Bird of Paradise patch on their shoulders. That was an indication, really, what was happening, and Sam has referred to it in Moresby, where the Army were not really understanding that the Maritime Element, or a new Navy, had to be run a little bit differently from a couple of battalions of soldiers.
Sam.
Yes, absolutely right. I mean, Jim referred to some of the problems we were having in Port Moresby at the time. I have to say that the commander of the PNG Defence Force, Brigadier Jim Norrie, was extremely strong personality, and he would brook absolutely no arguments that looked like being single service arguments, that the Navy or Air Force did things differently. And when Captain Lancaster or I would raise some issues such as Viv's been alluding to, we just thump the table and say, we're going to do it one way, we're going to do it my way, sort of thing. And that made, and this issue of, I remember there was a study done of the reorganisation of HMAS Teheran Gao to become the PNGDF patrol boat base. And the first study of that, which was basically done by Army officers, had this multi-headed organisation where there's going to be barracks staff, there was going to be a military police platoon, all these subsidiary Army organisations which are going to report back to their respective heads of corps back in Port Moresby. And it was also an unfortunate coincidence at the time that the Vietnam War was ending. And the Australian Army, which I think at the height of the Vietnam War ran itself up to about 70,000 people, if I remember rightly, was flushed with manpower. And there seemed to be a mission among the Army leaders in Port Moresby to create as many jobs as possible for Army personnel. And of course the Navy was such a small part of this. And we had this devil's own job of convincing people. I mean, again, Jim talked about the problems of the land border with Indonesia, and of course the land border with Indonesia is a major strategic issue for Papua New Guinea, but there was very little appreciation, despite our strong arguments, that PNG is also a big archipelagic country, a large EEZ, fish-rich waters, etc. It needs to be patrolled. There's remote islands that need to have sovereignty patrols, etc. The earlier segment mentioned the Coast Watcher organisation. Many of these small islands are quite remote, not visited by government. The patrol boats, etc., serve a useful sovereignty protection role by visiting these remote atolls, some of which are uninhabited. There was very little appreciation of that in Murray Barracks at the time, despite the best efforts of Captain Lancaster and myself to promote it, largely because we were totally swamped by these Army views led by this very, to be frank, quite arrogant brigadier who was not going to have a bar of anything. And of course we were also not helped at the time by the fact that reorganisation of the defence organisation was going on in Canberra, and the Navy to some extent in Canberra was losing its single service voice with the end of the Department of Navy and the Department of Defence taking over. And the Department of Defence organisation, I mean, in simple terms, was probably more receptive of what was coming out of Port Moresby from Jim Norrie and others, rather than sort of listening to any single service views or complaints from the Navy.
Yeah. Care to comment on that? I think I can see you're about to leap in there.
No, only in the sense that what Sam said is correct, and I'm on the record of saying this to others and in a published form, that in some of my cables back to Canberra, to Defence Canberra, I suggested that the looming cost of a defence force of the shape and size, the nature that was being proposed, could be detrimental in PNG, and it might be relevant to undertake some studies of the potential capabilities of a field force and a specifically trained component of the police to undertake this border patrol protection role. When word of that got back to Norrie, and I was not reporting through him, of course, I was reporting directly to Canberra. Someone had clearly mentioned or given him a copy of my message. He called me into his office and said, "You've got to stop this talk about a field force, and if you don't, I'll have you escorted to the airport and put on a plane and sent home." Now, that was a little bit of a braggadocio from his point of view. He would have found it difficult to do that, but it reflects the nature of the world at the time. And look, one can understand, we had 3 separate services in Australia. We had only ourselves come to a recognition that we had to create a joint defence organisation which better integrated the 3 services. And all of a sudden, we were trying to do this in a foreign country, remote from Canberra. We ourselves had little or no experience of what a joint defence force would look like. So the challenges of this integration and this creating a composite whole, nationally focused military capability for PNG was something we ourselves were only 3/4 of the way through. And so whilst we can be critical and look back, one needs to also understand that this was a challenge Australia was facing itself. Were we to be doing that now, that is to say helping create a new PNG capability, we would have been much better positioned and much better prepared. The only other thing I would note was, throughout all of this, Canberra's commitment to PNG was never in the form of a treaty commitment, because Australia did not want to become involved in internecine struggles within a then foreign country. So that was taking us a step back quickly. But at the back of our minds, we saw internal security as a major problem, and we saw a capable military capacity as important in that regard, despite the fact that we'd not helped prepare this capability for anything other than defending its borders, either from a ground force point of view or a maritime point of view. And air was only plugged in at the end of the day, because, as been mentioned earlier, the air capability was just tasked out of Australia. At one stage, we had visions of trying to retain a major forward air capability in PNG, but once Australia committed to building a major northern defence airbase, the Tyndall approach, all of that changed enormously. But people in the system were still operating in the narrow focus of the world that they came from, foreshadowing a challenge that would occur in Australia in the future. And so there's this real set of issues here. And it's not a simple issue, it's quite complicated.
I mean, I think at the time it was clear to a lot of us that we were building up a defence infrastructure, that there's no way in the world that an independent PNG Defence Force was going to go to manage that. I mean, with the headquarters of the PNG Defence Force in Murray Barracks, the various area headquarters around the country, the headquarters they wanted to establish over at Lombrum. And I think, I don't have the figures off the top of my head, but I think at the time, around this period in 1972, there was something like 700 ADF people serving in Papua New Guinea. And I mentioned that the build-up of people from the army side of things. There was also a build-up of people in Port Moresby from the naval side. I mentioned when I arrived in December 71, there was just Lieutenant McAllister and myself. By the end of 1972, off the top of my head, I would say there was at least a dozen RAN people in Port Moresby in various postings, personnel, logistics, operations areas of the headquarters of the PNG Defence Force. Additional postings for RAN people we hadn't had before, because there was this transfer of command responsibility which had previously been exercised over the patrol boats from Teheran Gao, had been transferred to Murray Barracks. And of course we were also taking over not just the patrol boats but the Army Landing Craft Squadron as well. And that's another story we might go into later about how the Army Landing Craft Squadron was absorbed into the Maritime Element.
Yeah. Viv, we're hearing that it was maybe too much too soon to hand independence across to PNG. And in fact, I think one of the PNGD officers, Colonel Reg Ranagi, said the same thing, that they weren't ready for independence and the transition was not going to work. Can you care to comment on that?
Yes. Once the political decision was made, we didn't have any choice. But talking to the local people, they were quite ready for self-government, but not independence. They were expecting self-government for about 10 years and gradually working towards it, and suddenly it was foisted upon them. They knew that they weren't ready. Michael Samari just after self-government, Michael Samari brought his cabinet to Manus. We were quite impressed talking to them. And
He was a good leader?
Yes, he was.
Yeah.
Well, the impression I had was. And his ministers were all genuinely interested in developing a worthwhile independent country. But talking to them, they even said, we're not going to be ready next year for independence. So Canberra just pushed the country too fast. Here was Defence Force still struggling to work out what was required. But the whole country really wasn't ready and wasn't going to be ready for a number of years.
Jim, in response to that, was there any sort of thought in Australia under the Whitlam government at the time that maybe they were going too fast, or the decision was made and we're pushing on?
I think it was a clear political decision. It should be remembered that the Labor Party, prior to the election, which brought them to power, publicly committed themselves to independence. In that early period, people like Bob Hawke, as then a trades union representative, was in PNG, also looking at the creation of PNG trades unions and other things. There's some wonderful stories about Hawke and his time there, which could be repeated later. But the point being that they were politically on that not the bandwagon. They were driving forward, and what they saw was a more progressive view of the world, equal to their view on the Vietnam War. So we're moving forward. The concerns then in the administration of all this is how to do this best as possible in the time frame, because the government had set a time on it. Now, this is at a time when we ourselves are just groping with the concept of really doing our own geostrategic assessments and developing our force capabilities initially on the basis of that perception of what our geostrategic environment is, and then coming down to the capabilities necessary to operate in that environment. And the 72 white paper, which I ended up being a draftsman on, was the beginning of this changed perception in the way in which we in Australia shaped our capabilities. We did none of that for PNG. We simply said, those are the capabilities you've got. Those are the capabilities we'll continue to fund through the Defence Cooperation Program. And for a number of years as Assistant Secretary PNG in the Defence Department, I ran that program of subventing the PNG Defence Organisation. So what I'm trying to say is the force of circumstances was such that there was little room for anyone to operate other than within those parameters. We were locked into independence. PNG and its people were understood that that was happening, but had reticence about it. And if you look at the political situation, Somari was Bangu Party, but the United Party, which consisted of significant votes in the Highlands and other areas, was almost totally against independence. And so you had this domestic environment in PNG itself, which raised questions about what it all meant, not least the fear of the unknown. But we were going ahead regardless. In my own mind, it's unfortunate that we were not all able to stand back and assess the situation with a little bit more thought and time, both from the civil administration of PNG, but equally and more importantly in terms of this discussion, the maritime, because we had yet to understand ourselves the significance of that strategic Pacific environment, which only after 72 began to be clearly stated as a fundamental driver in developing our defence capabilities and requirements, and that endures to today. Before that, we'd seen things somewhat differently as static land conflicts either in PNG as a possible of incursions or in Southeast Asia on the ground. And that change from our perspective didn't help. It was only later when we undertook work on, as a result of the development of 200 nautical mile zones, and I led a delegation around the Pacific with Australian New Zealand personnel to assess what their capabilities were in protecting their new maritime zones, which were zilch, that we came up with the concept of the Pacific Patrol Boat as a way of providing a capability and reinforcing the capacity of those countries, and at the same time injecting into the operation of those vessels some Australian naval personnel to give them a broader perspective of the Pacific and to reinforce Australia's recognition by the Pacific countries of Australia's geostrategic commitment to the region. But all of that came later. So again, it's almost force of circumstance, you know.
Yep. So Sam, PNG is going to get independence whether they want it, need it or like it. So how does the REN go about doing the whole transfer of the equipment, of the knowledge?
Yep. Well, I think Jim's largely said that. I think from a REN point of view, I think we were committed to this political environment. I think thinking back to my own thoughts at the time, as 1972 moved on, I mean, I had nothing else in mind other than the country was going to have self-government independent within a few years, and the mission was to achieve that as quickly as possible. I think Teheran Gao had a slightly different sort of attitude. I mentioned how the previous CEO of Teheran Gao had also been double-hatted as North PNG. I think he was personally quite upset when that responsibility, he lost large part of his job when the operational control of the patrol boats transferred to Port Moresby, and he reverted just to back to being a base commander, where he'd been previously been a genuine naval area commander. But from a Port Moresby point of view, I mean, Jim summed it up. I mean, I think we were committed to this political environment, move the country, get things going into the joint force environment as quickly as possible, but also very conscious from a naval point of view of the strategic requirement, the strategic necessity for the country to have a realistic maritime surveillance and patrol law enforcement type force. I just mentioned a couple of little issues there. Jim mentioned Mr. Nick Webb, who was the Australian Defence representative within the PNG Defence Organisation, the PNG Department of Defence. Nick played around with the idea of a Coast Guard rather than the maritime element of the PNG Defence Force, because Nick was having all these battles of his own at the policy level and was conscious that there was a real risk and foresaw indeed that the naval side of things, the maritime element side of things, was going to be totally swamped by the Khaki side of things. And he thought of the Coast Guard as perhaps being a police Coast Guard type force, part of the field force that Jim's been mentioning about, but something which would focus on, you know, the maritime requirements of the country, not being part of this very large army side of things. Another thing that we haven't mentioned so far is that Teheran Gao is very remote and very difficult to resupply, and clearly the PNG Defence Force was going to have a lot of trouble maintaining this very remote base, the most remote base of any of its bases. And that joint planning staff that I was part of, with the Colonel in charge, we investigated the possibilities, and I think we even secured some land in Madang for establish the main maritime element base to be in Madang rather than in Manus. And of course, unfortunately because of money and things like that, it never actually happened. Incidentally, that land I think we acquired or penciled in is now the site of the main National Maritime College, which is where all the engineers and technical people for the maritime element are actually trained through that maritime college in Madang.
But I think also at one point there was a base opened in Port Moresby, Basilisk. Was that was still an Australian base though?
No. I think the ship's name story there is that I mentioned the build-up of RAN people in Port Moresby, and we became, I mean, when I initially arrived in Port Moresby, my pay docs and personnel side looked after from Teheran Gao. The people in Port Moresby during 1972 became self-supporting, and for a ship's name was HMAS
But
Basilisk.
there were no there were no ships physically located.
No. And incidentally, the PNG Defence Force only recently has gone back to ships' names for its bases. And Teheran Gao is now PNGS Teheran Gao rather than the PNGDF patrol boat base. And the Army landing, what was the Army Landing Craft Squadron, now the PNGDF Landing Craft Squadron of Port Moresby is actually PNGS Basilisk.
Okay. Sorry, Viv.
Just going on that, Jim, and the police force. I was involved with officer training for the future. I went across to Ley and we had a working party trying to produce a curriculum and syllabus for the officer training in the new Joint Services College. The police were to be part of that. And after a while, the police said, we're not part of this, or we just couldn't fit in with the philosophy of the army, really, and pulled out. It's interesting. I got into a little bit of flack from Port Moresby over this because I was given the brief of creating an officer training structure to match the budget. Now we'd sent our officers down to Australia until that stage, and they went to Cerberus, they went to Watson, and went to sea and RA in ships. I had to try and come up with something that could be afforded. And the difficult part was finding a way of sea time for these midshipmen. And there was going to be a need for a glorified workboats, you know, with navigation equipment and things like that. But that went down like a lead balloon, understandably, because it wasn't going to produce officers of the right stature. But that was the sort of problems that Tim was talking about, and Sam. A PNG Defence Force, which the future PNG really couldn't afford.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Jim.
Look, I think in all of this, I stand back and I think, my God, despite all of this, those people at the operating level made this happen. Despite this, different cultures, political pressure, short fuse decision making, the service personnel involved in these programs made it happen. And we left a highly effective force in PNG. Remember, a force that was able to go on and undertake an overseas deployment, albeit with Australian support, in support of an internal insurgency, actually, in a neighbouring country. So the capabilities and the capacities were there. But as the years went by, the truth of the problem began to emerge. I would continue to go to Moresby for defence cooperation discussions, talk to successive secretaries of defence about their budgetary problems, their inability to pay, their inability to support the fuel and maintenance for the attack class patrol boats, the difficulty of the cost of maintaining aircraft, and then the problem of supporting deployed operational units against a set budget. And so there's been this slow attrition of PNG capabilities, but I think it's a credit to the Australian servicemen involved that they were able to walk away from this and feel that despite the problems, they left something that worked, that something that was viable, and that something that actually, for a significant period of time, became an important core of the national identity of PNG. And that was reflected at the Hubert Murray Stadium with the taking down of the Australian flag and the raising of the PNG flag, and the military presence there, which was seen by the populace as a reflection that they were a country, there was substance there, and that was very, very important at the time.
Sam, so what do we hand over to PNG as in the way of hardware And what's changed? Has there been a lasting impression there?
Well, we handed over, in terms of hardware, it was the 5 attack class patrol boats, which were the PNG Patrol Boat Squadron, and the 2 LCHs, Buna and Salamoa, which became PNG ships and are still operational. The attack class patrol boats, of course, gone and been replaced by the Pacific patrol boats. Teheran Gao is still there, PNG's Teheran Gao. The patrol boat base, although it's been totally emasculated over the last few years with the establishment of the refugee centre there. I visited Manus last year and was surprised. That refugee centre has been built totally within the base. And now with the closing of the refugee centre, we have this problem. The base commander there was terribly apprehensive. You're going to close the refugee centre. What am I going to do with all these buildings and infrastructure and stuff? I can't maintain that. I can't keep it going. What's the Australian government's plan for for decommissioning it all? And I don't think, as far as I know, there's been no plans for decommissioning. So we've saddled the PNG Defence Force with this huge liability at the patrol boat base at Lombrum. The landing craft squadron is still there on the waterfront in Port Moresby, but it's now being encroached upon by land reclamation works, container terminals, and the Defence Force have been told to move out of the landing craft squadron and to have been offered a new site further down the coast, which is a site which requires massive dredging, earthworks, etc., to build a base there, and the whole thing now is on hold. So the landing craft squadron bases, which it's there now, but it's under this threat of removal. At the time of self-government, whilst the plans were there for the two LCHs to become part of the PNG Defence Force, the Army still had some of its LCM8s there. And as well as initially when the when the PNG Defence Force was established in 1973 and the Army Landing Craft Squadron came in to being part of the Maritime Element, it then consisted of a very old landing craft, an ALC-50, which was virtually past the point of any worthwhile repair. And I think there were 3 LCM8s and a vessel called, a converted fishing boat called the Taruki. The Taruki, the LCM8s have no self-contained navigational equipment at all. So when the LCM8s, the Army used to operate on this fashion of, if the LCM8s deployed away from Port Moresby, the Taruki would go along as a mothership to provide navigational support, etc. Unfortunately, not long after the PNG Defence Force was established and this Army organisation had come under the Maritime Element, the Taruki was wrecked on the south coast of Papua, and it was a very messy situation. Initially, due to some finger trouble between the base and the waterfront and the headquarters, we didn't know for a couple of days at headquarters level that the Taruki was missing. We conducted an air search then down. We knew it had gone past Samurai. Let's say this was now Wednesday. We knew it had gone past Samurai on the Sunday. Air search down the coast. There's the Taruki lying on its beam ends on the edge of a reef. No sign of any life. So what happened to the crew? So we had to do an air search into the Gulf of Papua, and eventually the crew were found on the life raft. Fortunately, just towards the end of the day, when we could pick them up next morning. But it was an unfortunate story, if you like, an unfortunate beginning to the Army. And there was a lot of ill will, I have to say, within the Army landing squadron becoming part of the Navy, or what they saw as part of the Navy, really part of the Joint Maritime Element. The Australian Army withdrew the LCM8s from Port Moresby, and of course the LCHs arrived, and that's the organisation that's still there. There's actually now 3, we've given them another, with the paying off of the LCHs in Australia, a 3rd LCH decommissioned REN vessel has been passed to the PNG Defence Force. So actually now got 3 LCHs up there.
So with the Pacific patrol boats that Australia has provided and the 3 LCHs, Australia really hasn't let go of the PNGDF, the Maritime Element.
Oh, not at all, but I've recently had some visits to PNG, and I'm afraid the Maritime Element is still very much the poor cousin of the land element. There's arrangements in place at present to increase the size of the PNG Defence Force, the manpower of the PNG Defence Force, by establishing a 3rd Battalion of the PIR. I mean, this is an incredible decision because the patrol boats at present don't do any surveillance at all in PNG waters unless it's paid for by the National Fisheries Authority. There are no sovereignty patrols, etc. There's no appreciation, seems to be no appreciation within Murray Barracks of the fact that the country is a large archipelagic country with fish-rich waters that need to be protected, etc. To their credit, though, the 4 Pacific patrol boats the PNG Defence Force has at present, they seem to have cannibalised 2 to allow 2 to be operational, and those 2 operational are doing good things. In fact, in 2016, they embarked on a deployment. They went from PNG across to the waters off Sumatra to undertake an exercise with the Indonesian Navy, and that was conducted well. At the last Kakadu exercise, I think in 2016, a PNG patrol boat was awarded the award, I think, of being the most efficient patrol boat in that particular exercise. So, and when I went on board these patrol boats, the 2 that are fully operational, I mean, you can feel on board a ship if it's well run, well operated. I had a total feeling that these 2 ships were working well, but they're working well within the constraints of the tight budgets, etc., from Murray Barracks, and the fact that they're doing, operationally, they seem to be doing more naval type things, exercising with other Pacific patrol boats. All this, of course, is funded by Australia, rather than doing actual national tasks in their own waters, for which they require national funding for.
Do you have any last thoughts on PNG and the independence issue?
No, just going back to that handover period, where life in Teheran Gao for Australians was very pleasant. Banyans and John Stacey had built this magnificent oval and that sort of thing. So we left Teheran Gao in very good shape, and it's just a pity that the finances weren't there to keep it as it was in 1972-73.
Jim, any last thoughts?
Only to say that we in Australia hopefully will learn lessons from what happened in PNG, not only in terms of our future relationship with PNG, but also to the strategically important countries in the Southwest Pacific. And it's a challenge for us in our strategic assessments, force capability developments, to recognise where we sit and what our role is in that regard. And separately from the point of view of PNG, I've always hoped that we might be able to encourage them themselves to review their geostrategic environment to better base an assessment on their defence capabilities, which at the moment still seem to be driven by the need for ground force capabilities, whereas some would suggest that greater emphasis, and Sam's comments about the modest capability they have, greater emphasis on maritime patrol for countries that have rich archipelagic fishing zones and the like. It seems to me important to the long-term economic future of PNG that a greater investment is made in that area.
Reportage there, Sam?
Yes, quick one. I mean, just following on from Jim's point there. Unfortunately, I think within the RAN, and the priority, of course, is still understandable warfighting type capabilities, and I don't think support, whilst we provide support for the PNGDF Maritime Element as much as we can in terms of training and, of course, the equipment, etc., I still don't think we give sufficient priority to the sort of issues that Jim's been talking about. But I'll just also mention an anecdote here to finish with, that in 1974 there's a royal tour to Papua New Guinea Queen, Prince Philip, the whole box and dice, including Lord Louis Mountbatten. And the Queen and her party departed ahead of Lord Louis, and we had Lord Louis in Port Moresby for a couple of extra days, and I found myself in the position of having to squire him around and take him up to Byre River Bird Sanctuary, look after him, etc. When he was departing, it was a Queen's Flight aircraft at Jackson's Airport, and Michael Somare, who of course then was Chief Minister of PNG, was out there to farewell him. And Lord Louis says to Michael Somare, just as he's about to come aboard the aircraft, "Oh, come with me, Mr. Somare, we'll have a little walk up the tarmac together." And off they toddled. And I thought it was my job to follow along behind. And the conversation ran along the lines of, "Now, Mr. Somare," says Lord Louis, "you know I've had some experience in taking countries through to independence. And I just think of you a few words of advice. And the key word of advice is don't forget your previous colonial masters. They've been trying their best to do things for you. Don't you ever forget that, Mr. Somare." Mr. Somare nodded, yes, sir, yes, sir, yes, sir. And Lord Louis got on the aircraft.
Thanks for that. Sadly, that's all we have time for today. My thanks to Sam, Jim and Viv for joining us. And thank you for their insights. And thank you for joining us as well. That's all we have. Bye for now.